So we have a little more time for Q&A with our two panelists this morning. We thought in putting together the content and coverage of this conference that it was very important early on in the discussion to have a discussion and hear directly from young scholars and people who could speak directly to what it's going to mean, what it is meaning for, as people enter their scholarly careers, their scientific careers, to embrace or be aware of the open access model. If we make this transition that we heard a bit about from Pete Binfield just now, what does that mean in terms of scholarly career arcs and different kinds of career patterns that are going to be there in the new scholars that are entering the field? So this panel was very important to us to have early on in the conference. Nick Shockey is the Director of Programs and Engagement for the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, SPARC, and is the founding director of the Right to Research Coalition, R2RC. He is supported by SPARC. The R2RC is an international alliance of local, national, and international student organizations that advocate for researchers, universities, governments, and students themselves to adopt open scholarly publishing practices. So Nick has a wide exposure and connections with people in the field, and we're going to hear a bit about that. Under Nick's direction, the R2RC has grown to represent just around 7 million students in more than 100 countries around the world and is facilitating a great many advocacy programs as part of that. Our other speaker is Erin McKiernan. And Erin is a researcher in medical sciences at the National Institute of Public Health in Mexico. She received her PhD in physiological sciences in 2010 from the University of Arizona, and her research involves the integration of experimental and computational approaches to solve diverse problems in epidemiology, physiology, and neuroscience. She's an advocate for open access, open data, and open source, and she often blogs about her experiences with open science. For those of you who were at the LPC meeting earlier this year in Kansas City, you have had a preview of her talk today, and we very much wanted her to repeat it for this conversation as well. So without any more delay, let me turn it over to Nick.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I've been looking forward to this presentation. I'm often speaking in front of student audiences or other audiences that aren't as well aware of open access, so it's really fun to get to come and talk to a group that is, and really get to focus on the work that we're doing with the student community. So with my presentation, I'm hoping to give sort of an overview of how students and early career researchers have really begun to get involved in open access, both in awareness-raising efforts as well as in advocacy. A couple housekeeping things before I begin in earnest. My presentation's online here. You can either scan the QR code or there's a short link if you want to follow along online or use the slides afterwards. And of course, as a good open advocate, they're licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Only license. So I think we've already gotten a little introduction to, I guess, my organization, the Right to Research Coalition. It's just shy of being 5 years old. We launched here in the U.S. in 2009 with 6 original U.S.-based student organization signatories. And we're based around what we call the Student Statement on the Right to Research, which is essentially a statement of principles saying that with the internet, these academic scholarly research articles really should be free to anybody with an internet connection, and calls on universities, researchers, research funders, and students themselves to take concrete steps to really make open access the new normal. And since 2009, we've grown really quickly. We're now a fully international alliance of a little bit more than 75 graduate and undergraduate student organizations. And those 75 or so collectively represent just shy of 7 million students in a little bit over 100 countries. And it's really an incredibly diverse group. Actually, more than half of our membership is now based outside of the U.S., so it really has fully sort of international scope. It's just been fantastic to work with students, and so a lot of this presentation is really sort of going through the greatest hits of what the students that we've been working with have done over the last 5 years, and I think it's really exciting to see some of the things that they've been able to accomplish. So that's what I'll talk about for the most part, but then I'll close with some ideas for how people in this room can help facilitate student and early career researcher involvement before I turn things over to the fantastic Erin. So just to begin, I think this problem of getting access to scholarly and scientific research is something that students in particular certainly have quite a bit of experience with, as well as, I think pretty much anybody that is involved in academic research. But this is a familiar frustration that when you talk to student audiences, they immediately know what you're talking about, which I think really helps to get students involved, is because when you talk about the paywall, this is immediately sort of how they feel. I was trying to decide, there's also a similar GIF that's sort of the Hulk turning into Hulk form when he hits the paywall. So students, experience this all the time. Students have great workarounds, which unfortunately they have to resort to. A couple of my favorites are student organization Facebook groups have now turned into sort of like messaging boards for trying to get access to articles. This is a screenshot from one of the organizations we work with, European Federation of Psychology Student Associations. And I think all these posts are from about 3 days' time. And I think they average something like 50 to 60 plus posts per week of people requesting articles like this. Maybe my favorite example that some of you may be familiar with is the hashtag Can Haz PDF, where people are looking for an article, can't get access to it, tweet the link to the article they're looking for with that hashtag, and then other people that monitor it will then email them a copy of the paper, unfortunately often illegally due to copyright law. But I think this is another great sort of workaround that I think many people in the next generation have sort of set up to deal with this problem of extremely restricted access to research. So students get the problem. Early career researchers get the problem. But the problem with getting them more involved in promoting open access is that when they actually hit the paywall, when they experience the problem, there's no sort of pop-up that says, this journal, tetrahedron in this case, costs $15,000 for 1 year subscription, making it too expensive for most of the world's population. There's a better way called open access. And so we sort of have our work cut out for us as advocates to actually go out and proactively engage with this community. Because when they hit the problem, they don't see the solution. They don't see the broken system behind the paywall. And that, in fact, there is a very viable alternative in open access. So that leads to our work to engage students and early career researchers. And I just want to start off with, I think, a particularly fantastic story about how engaging students can really lead to something quite special. And that is the story of two students I met a little bit over a year ago, Joe MacArthur and David Carroll, who are leaders in this sort of National Medical Student Association in the UK called Medicine UK. I met them in Baltimore at the International Federation of Medical Student Associations March meeting. And they came to the meeting sort of, having just heard about open access, interested about it, tweeted at me before the meeting, and I met with them. We had great conversations at the meeting. They're really energized about sort of taking this idea of open access and making a national level campaign, or really re-energizing the national level campaign within Medicine UK. So about a month later, I got this email. You can tell that it's a student email because I got it at 1:25 in the morning. But they were sort of thinking about what they could do as students. And sort of the thing they settled on is this part, talking about how they really wanted to build something that would show how often people around the world hit paywalls. And so as ambitious students, they sort of launched headlong into this project, which I think is a perfect illustration of why it's important to work with students, their energy, their passion, their creativity. And the project that they ultimately created is called the Open Access Button. You can see they almost had the name in this email. It's the Open Access Extension Button, but it's called the Open Access Button. They participated in a hack day that was hosted by the BMJ and sort of pitched a few coders on this idea of building sort of a global map of frustration, that would map out all the places where people hit paywalls. And so they built it over a weekend at this hack day, the initial prototype, and actually got runner-up. So they refined this over a number of months, and then in November of last year, they launched the official beta version called the Open Access Button at oabutton.org. And first of all, I think this is remarkable because these students, when I met them in March of last year, really barely knew what open access was. And in less than 9 months, they went from that to building this prototype, and the amount of press that this project's gotten is pretty incredible. So I think this is really the ultimate testament to sort of the energy of the next generation. So the way this project actually works is you go to the Open Access Button website, you fill in your name, and then when you're browsing academic research, a chemistry journal, and inevitably run into the paywall, you click the Open Access button up at the top. You can see the screens are so big, I can't really. So you click the Open Access button, and then it creates this pop-up. And this pop-up automatically scrapes the DOI, the title of the article, the URL. I've got a laser pointer. I really feel like my professors from college. This is great. So anyway, it scrapes automatically the DOI, the URL, some other information, and then allows you to include some other information about why you were looking for the article, for example. You can see here they had the default text is, "I'm trying to save lives, damn it." So when you hit the button, it automatically takes that data and creates the sort of global map of frustration and charts all of these collisions with paywalls across the world. And some places you can see sort of an explosion of paywalls. And then when you click in, this is what it looks like when you actually read why people were looking. And this particular bit of functionality is really interesting because it's been effective in capturing some really good stories about people that are trying to get access to the journal literature that aren't sort of your traditional researcher. So it's been great for uncovering that. Then the second part of the button that's really the sort of the future of the project is that after it logs your information, it actually tries to get you access to a freely available copy of an article that's otherwise behind a paywall. So right now, the sort of way it does that's fairly rudimentary. It searches Google Scholar by the DOI and the title, so it essentially takes out a few steps from what a lot of researchers would do to try to find a freely available copy. But there's some really, really interesting new bits of code they're working on to really, really improve this. And I think one of the most exciting bits is they are really close to coding, part of the button that will automatically send an email to the corresponding author of the paper anytime somebody tries to get access through the Open Access button. And the email, would say something like, somebody was trying to read your research but couldn't because it's behind a paywall. If you send us a link to a place where this paper is freely available online, we'll make sure that never happens again. And so next time somebody tries to get access to the article, it will serve them that link to where it's posted publicly. And there's also some discussion about doing this at a more systematic level in partnering with repositories to bulk ingest links to freely accessible copies of these articles. So I think you can start to see how powerful of a tool this really, really could be. And ultimately, I think the goal of this project is to make this a genuinely useful research tool that researchers want to naturally build into their research workflow. That's really hopefully good at finding and connecting users with freely available copies of paywalled articles. And then if it does that, then it will succeed even more at its mission of being an advocacy tool. And I think just as impressive as the tool itself is the team that these two students have sort of built around the project. I think this is not even everybody that's now a part of the team, but these are, I think, the 15 sort of core people in the student team, including Sarah Melton, who we have in the audience right here. But I think it's important to, I'll leave Sarah up there. I think it's important to note that this really is an entirely student-conceived and run project and really speaks to, as I've already said, the creativity, the passion of students and how they can really bring serious change to this movement. And it's gotten quite a bit of press, actually. Its launch was covered in The Guardian as well as Scientific American. And actually, earlier this year, there's this great quote from Sander Dekker, the Dutch State Secretary of Science, talking about, how he's impressed by the project, which was great to see. But it's great to see, this project getting, such well-deserved, I think, publicity. And as a member of the steering committee for the project, I have to include a shameless plug. Right now, we are in the middle of a crowdfunding campaign for the Open Access button to sort of do a bit of bridge funding for the next stage of development. And actually, if you go to openaccessbutton.org, there's a link there. But they're also trying new and innovative models for actually supporting student work in this area. So I just wanted to mention that bit. So That is the open access button. I just wanted to sort of start with I think, what's a fantastic example of sort of the power of student involvement. And sort of building off of this, I want to give an insider tip for those of you that are hopefully going to go away from this and start working with students. Is to work with student governments and student organizations. The way we actually began working with David and Joe, as I mentioned, was through Medicine there, the National Medical Student Association in the UK. And the reason working with student organizations and governments in particular can be so important is because one of the issues with working with students is that they go and graduate, which is great for them, but at the same time it builds in sort of a natural turnover. And so by partnering with student organizations and governments, you can sort of naturally, hopefully, institutionalize the issue so that, as new students come in, they're sort of brought along and educated about open access. So it's sort of a great way to target students. And before I move on, I also wanted to mention with Medicine, the initial project we did with this group was actually to engage the British Medical Association. They're very close with the BMA. And actually in June of 2012, they were successful in passing a statement through the BMA, actually getting the BMA's endorsement of open access, which is fantastic and I think is an example of the type of work we're starting to do with student organizations, is to actually get them to engage with the scholarly societies that are above them to try to change the conversation around open access and hopefully get more scholarly society support for the issue. So I want to pivot a bit and talk first about sort of students and early career researchers as educators and open access awareness raisers. And then I'll pivot to talk about them as open access advocates on campus and then up through the national, international level. So some of you may know that students actually have a long history of engagement with open access as awareness raisers. And in fact, Open Access Week actually started out in 2007 as the National Day of Action for Open Access that was actually co-led by a student organization called the Students for Free Culture and celebrated on over a dozen campuses around the country. So students really were at the beginning of what we call Open Access Week. And some of the ideas that they had were just fantastic. My personal favorite is a project called Over Price Tags, where in an effort to raise awareness about the incredible prices of scholarly journals, the students actually printed out price tags like these and actually stuck them on the most expensive journals in their library and then put them on display in the front of the library, which I think is absolutely fantastic. So that's how it started, but as I think many of you know, Open Access Week has really taken off since then, and is celebrated in dozens and dozens of countries around the world. And actually, we just announced last week that the theme for this year will in fact be Generation Open. And so it will, in large part, focus on the importance of students and early career researchers and sort of, the end goal of making scholarly publishing open. But it will also include sort of other takes on this idea of Generation Open and sort of discuss sort of how open access impacts researchers at different stages of their career. So it's not just about the students that will certainly highlight their involvement. But beyond sort of starting this idea of Open Access Week, students have really led some really interesting projects around open access awareness raising. I think one of my favorite comes from the Medical Students Association of Kenya, whom we've worked with for a number of years now. And they got really involved in Open Access Week in 2012. And actually, in 1 week, managed to educate nearly half of all Kenyan medical students about open access. They had events at, I think, at nearly every medical campus in the country. It was just fantastic, and while doing this, they also touched a lot of professors and administrators that led to some additional momentum that I'll talk about in a minute. But now we've actually seen entire student organizations being founded around this idea of raising awareness of open access. There's one called Open Access Nigeria that literally is just launched and is setting up chapters on all the medical schools in Nigeria, and these students are incredible, and they're incredibly passionate about this issue and raising awareness within their communities and really, I think, making some serious progress. We've also seen students start to institutionalize open access education. Coming out of a meeting that we had last November in Berlin, the sort of graduate student government at the University of Hong Kong is now working with their administration to include open access in the sort of mandatory orientation for graduate students at that university, which I think is a great way to make sure that the students that are coming in are at least exposed to this idea of open access and get a basic sort of education about what it is, that can hopefully sort of form of bulk work against some of the common misconceptions that are out there. Then also students have been very involved in creating some of the sort of top resources that we use to spread the word about open access. Many of you might have seen the Open Access Explained video that we did with PhD Comics about 2 years ago. That's now seen just a little bit over 200,000 views on YouTube, which isn't too bad for an 8-minute video about scholarly publishing. But the reason this video actually happened was because of a UNT student, in fact, Matt Cooper, who was a student here at UNT, and the, I guess, past president of the National Association of Graduate and Professional Students, actually had a personal relationship with Jorge Cham, the illustrator behind PhD Comics, and was the person that made the initial connection that allowed this to happen. So if you've ever used this video, you can thank UNT and the students that are behind it that really allowed it to happen. So shifting gears from awareness raising to advocacy, I think it behooves all of us as open access advocates to really partner and fully partner with students and early career researchers in doing these types of advocacy. We've seen just incredible examples that I'll talk about of sort of the power that students add to open access initiatives on campus. I think my favorite local example is again from Kenya, where the University of Nairobi established an institutional open access policy in 2012. And actually, students had quite a bit to do with this policy. You'll remember in October of 2012 was the year they had that huge Open Access Week celebration where they touched a lot of the administrators and faculty on different campuses. And in partnering with the librarians on campus, this is a quote from one of the librarians they worked with talking about sort of the power of students to be one of the best catalysts for change. Something really magical happened when the students got involved. It really changed the way the conversation was going and got the administration at the university to think about the issue differently and really cause progress quite quickly. So this, I think, is a fantastic example of students catalyzing institutional open access policies. But we've seen similar movement elsewhere at the University of Colorado. There had been long sort of discussions about pushing more institutional support for open access, and at least from my understanding, it sort of had been going more slowly than they had liked, but then the overall student government at the University of Colorado got involved in the issue, and it's actually quite a sort of big institution on campus. They actually own a few of the buildings on campus, they're deeply, deeply ingrained within the university, and so when they took interest in the issue, again, it really changed the way the administration approached it and was thinking about it, and then I think within a year of their involvement, they passed a fairly strong statement supporting sort of their institutional commitment to open access. Not a full open access policy, but certainly a strong sort of step in that direction that, again, was largely helped by student involvement. And then many of you are also aware of the system-wide institutional open access policy that was passed at the University of California. Again, something that was very much supported by students both locally with student groups like Open Access Berkeley, as well as on sort of the higher level with organizations like the University of California Student Association. And again, in California, we saw a really, really interesting thing happen last year, which was, dramatic pause while I take a sip of water. We saw PhD candidates at the Stanford Graduate School of Education actually vote by a 97% margin to include themselves in their institutional open access policy, which I think is fantastic. And so now we're starting to work with other student governments and other campuses to try to get institutional open access policies expanded to include graduate students as well. And actually, with the University of California system-wide mandate that I just mentioned, a number of graduate students within the system were actually advocating for them to be included in that policy. And unfortunately, it didn't work out before that policy went out, but again, is sort of an active area of student involvement. Sort of taking things up a level to the state level, we've begun to see a number of state-level open access bills. This one from California called AB 609 would require that state-funded research in California be made freely available online. The state of California funds a little bit more than $100 million in research a year, and it actually passed the Assembly in the last legislative session by a very, very wide margin. Unfortunately, didn't quite make it out of the Senate committee it was referred to, and has been granted reconsideration in this Assembly. So there's lots of momentum there, but again, something that students were very heavily involved in. The University of California Student Association actually had a representative, Meredith Niles, testify in the California State Senate in support of that legislation, talking about how open access in this particular bill were important to the students at the University of California. We've also seen student involvement in other types of related state-level legislation. This is 2 resolutions that were passed in North Dakota actually supporting the use of open textbooks in institutions of higher education there, that the National Association of Graduate and Professional Students, sort of the big national graduate student association here in the United States, submitted a couple letters in support of, and we know from working with those legislators that these letters were actually very helpful in ultimately moving these 2 resolutions. And I think this also speaks to how students' interest in these issues naturally expands, that when they work on open access, they naturally see the opportunities in other very closely related areas like open educational resources and open data. So Spark, for example, has sort of naturally started moving from open access, where we've been very active for decades, into OER and open data, and we're starting to see students naturally make that shift as well. Moving from the state to the federal level, many of you are probably well aware of the legislative vehicles we have in DC. This is the Fair Access to Science and Technology Research Act, or FASTER, that would essentially expand the NIH policy, or in another sense codify the White House Directive, which I'll talk about in a second, and require that all or most publicly funded research in the U.S. be made freely available within 6 months, and actually also call for those articles to be made available in formats and under terms that allow for their reuse. So starting to get at the importance of not only free access to research, but open access, which normally, if I was talking to sort of a group that was less familiar, I'd really hammer on the importance of openness, but I think we all have it in this room, hopefully. Again, this is something that students have been very deeply engaged in, and actually through 2 of our Right to Research member organizations, the National Association of Graduate and Professional Students and the American Medical Student Association, we've seen over 1,000 congressional lobbying visits from students talking about these different bits of legislation and how open access affects particularly graduate students, and the importance. And really, I mean, they've been successful in getting new co-sponsors on the legislation, and I think the student voice really is especially compelling on this issue. I think all of you probably are familiar with the White House Directive that passed or was instituted in February of last year, that was sort of catalyzed by this White House We the People petition that students actually had quite a bit of involvement in getting it to the signature threshold that it needed to get to, so that ultimately we could get this great directive. But I guess one thing that's probably less well known is a great story that we actually were successful in placing an op-ed in the Washington Post that was co-written by Matt Cooper, our lovely UNT student, who was the president of the National Association of Graduate and Professional Students at the time, and Liz Wiley, who's the president of the American Medical Student Association. And this was submitted right after that White House We the People petition hit its signature threshold. And the interesting thing about this is that there were actually a number of sort of top-tier open access advocates in the U.S. that were trying to get a similar op-ed placed, and weren't able to do it because newspapers didn't think it was that interesting that open access advocates were going to talk about how great open access was. But when these 2 presidents of these 2 student organizations submitted this op-ed, it was essentially immediately accepted, and I think published roughly within a week's time in the print edition of the Washington Post. And we know that this circulated within the White House, and I think really helped to raise the visibility of this particular issue and show that there was a wide community of people that were behind that petition and would be paying attention to the administration's response and expected some serious policy to come from that petition. I think another great example of sort of the power of the student voice on this issue is this just incredible high school student that I've had the pleasure of working with over the last year or so. Some of you may be familiar with Jack Andraka. I'll post this picture to potentially jog the memory of a few of you that might have seen this making the rounds on the internet. But Jack is a remarkable student. At the age of 15, he came up with a novel diagnostic for pancreatic, ovarian, and lung cancer using carbon nanotubes based largely off the research that he could find online. There are a number of PLOS articles that he references, as well as some articles that he was able to get because he took his parents' credit card and actually bought a lot of articles, which is interesting. Good that Jack was able to do that. But this diagnostic really has the potential to be a breakthrough. It's potentially much faster, much more sensitive, and much less expensive than the current diagnostic for pancreatic cancer. It's still early on, there's a sort of a long road ahead in sort of actually bringing it to market, or to actually, be a product that can be used. But it really has the potential to revolutionize diagnostics and a whole host of other instances. And Jack's actually turned out to be a fantastic open access advocate. We did a video interview with him that's on the Right to Research website, whether it's with him and Dr. Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health, talking about sort of the importance of open access in medical research. He's also done a number of visits to the Hill in DC, and it's great because when you talk to congressional representatives and tell them that Jack is coming, more often than not, you actually meet with the representative themselves, which is really cool. And we actually had a meeting with Jack right off the floor of the Senate with Senator Barbara Mikulski, his senator, who's the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, making her one of the most powerful members of the body. And she knew Jack was so warm when we came in, and so he's just been an incredibly effective advocate, and I think, again, really speaks not only to the power of the student voice on this issue, but also speaks to sort of the importance of open access. I mean, this is the perfect case of sort of the unintended or unexpected consequences of when you allow anybody with an internet connection full access to the research literature, so that they can do their research and they don't have to be at a university. In Jack's case, he wasn't even old enough to drive himself to university at the time. And actually, I'll just mention that he was on the Colbert Report on October 30th of last year, and actually mentioned open access in the interview, which was really, really, really exciting. So he's been fantastic at highlighting this issue. Reaching the end, I just wanted to mention that students have also pushed us in new directions with their advocacy that we hadn't yet explored. Partnering with the International Federation of Medical Student Associations, this past December, we hosted a side event attached to the United Nations Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals, essentially advocating for the representatives there to consider including both open access and open educational resources in the Sustainable Development Goals that they're currently drafting, which was an idea that was brought to us by the IFMSA students that wasn't something we were doing before, and it's really sort of an entire new arena of advocacy that we're now playing in because of student involvement. So to close, before I turn things over to Aaron, I just want to give a couple very, brief suggestions for how you can sort of work with students and early career researchers. Pretty basic. So the first thing is just to start the conversation with students and early career researchers. As I mentioned, we're all so familiar with that problem. So when you reach out, they'll get exactly what you're talking about. So really just starting this conversation and inviting them in to be a part of the work that you're doing to promote open access. So after starting that conversation, really sort of trying to put students and early career researchers at the core of your work around open access, both trying to educate campuses about the issue, about, for example, what UNT's open access policy means, trying to dispel misconceptions. These are all things that students can really be employed to great effect, to help raise awareness. And also, as I've sort of talked about a bit, there's sort of a magical partnership, I think, between particularly librarians and students, because librarians have the expertise on the issue. They have the local context about how the difficulties in getting access to research play out on your campus. And students are really comfortable playing that role, I think, in most cases, as the outspoken advocate and sort of starting these conversations with faculty senates and with individual faculty. So we've seen a really productive partnership start to form increasingly between librarians and other open access advocates and students around advocacy and awareness raising. And then finally, and I think this is where I'll dovetail most with Aaron's presentation, really trying to support student and early career research involvement in actually making their own work open access. So that obviously involves awareness about open access, awareness about quality open access journals and their disciplines, or in the cases where they can't publish in an open access journal, letting them know that in most cases they could make a copy of their manuscript freely available through an institutional repository. If you have an open access fund on campus, making sure that they know that you have a fund set aside to help cover article processing fees, or that many open access publishers will waive or reduce these fees for students or early career researchers or people that otherwise wouldn't be able to afford to publish in that journal. And I know that Erin will talk a lot more about that, so I won't steal her thunder too much. And then finally, this is where I'm really going to back off because I know that Erin's going to hit this point hard. Really, I think there's a culture change that needs to happen in terms of reforming the way that researchers are assessed to get us away from this impact factor model, that really puts tremendous pressure on particularly early career researchers to publish in disproportionately high impact journals, that they feel that they're going to be judged on, and that, where they publish, that they have to publish in Science or Nature, Cell, or what have you in order to, hit the career trajectory they want. And there's some really great efforts underway, like the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment and others, to try to sort of decouple the way we judge a researcher's work from the impact factor and try to judge work at a more individual level. But I think this is certainly much more long-term than the other things that I've talked about, but every bit is important in terms of trying to recreate an incentive structure that actually helps early career researchers not have to decide between whether to publish in an open access journal and publishing in a subscription-based journal that might have an impact on their career, which is something that Aaron has been outspoken about and has a commitment to publishing in open access journals. And so with that, I will turn things over to Aaron.